Hi, I'm Jess Fields. Welcome to the show. The other day I spoke to religion journalist Terry Mattingly for the second time about the story that you might expect for a religion journalist to be talking about right now. That is the Jerry Falwell Jr. scandal at Liberty University. And the other big story that seems to engulf our media now, of course, the election that's coming up now just a little over a month and a half away. So both of these stories consumed a lot of time for us. We went through details and insights that Mattingly has on these issues. If you want to learn more about him, he blogs at getreligion.org. He runs the syndicated column on religion that appears in hundreds of newspapers every week. But Terry is an interesting guest, and I think regardless of your views, you'll find the interview to be very interesting. Religion journalist Terry Mattingly. Joining me now is religion journalist Terry Mattingly, and he has been a guest on the program before. Terry, thank you for joining us again.
Glad to be back.
Well, the thing in the news right now that I know you have been paying attention to is this scandal with Jerry Falwell Jr. We're going to get to that in just a moment. But first, for those that maybe are unfamiliar with what you do and your work, could you give us a little bit of a background?
Okay, I basically wear three hats at this point in my life. I am a nationally syndicated columnist, currently with the Universal Syndicate, and I've been writing the weekly On Religion column. We're coming up on 32 years. And then I write and lead a blog called getreligion.org, which is about 17 years old. Something like, I'm told, 14 million words of media criticism in that website and lots of other stuff. And then I serve as a senior fellow at the Overby Center at Ole Miss in Mississippi. The Overby Center deals with religion, politics, and everything seems to kind of wind its way back to issues of the First Amendment. And I don't teach there. I don't drive down and spend massive amounts of time there, but we plan programs several times a year related to religion, press coverage, and politics.
So Terry, we talked a little bit about this last time on the last interview that we did, but could you just kind of briefly go through the history of how you even got to where you're a syndicated religion columnist? I mean, how does somebody become a syndicated religion columnist? What an interesting job.
Well, at Baylor University in the early and mid 70s, I did a double major in journalism and American history and had a series of interesting events and a mentor, a very important man in my life named David McCam, a very famous journalism professor in Texas, who still lives in Houston and retired from teaching at the University of Houston at age 80 or something like that. I mean, David's a legend in journalism education. Especially in Texas. And I got intrigued with the whole subject of covering religion. I stayed at Baylor and did a master's degree in the Department of Church-State Studies, which was an interdisciplinary degree in theology, political science, history, and law. And once again, emphasized American religion and church-state studies. Went up to the University of Illinois. My wife is a computer-based reference librarian, and Urbana, Illinois is the mecca of modern library work, especially anything having to do with a computer. And we went up there in 1978. I went to work for the local paper, writing a column about rock music while serving as a copy editor, working religion in whenever I could. And from there, I went to the Charlotte News, which got merged into the Charlotte Observer. And that's relevant to our current discussions because I was there at the time the PTL scandal began to break, the Jim and Tammy Baker scandal. In fact, got some of the original leaks that led to the fall of that empire. Went from there to the Rocky Mountain News in Denver. And while I was there, I started writing this weekly column started off for Scripps Howard, which owned the Rocky Mountain News, may it rest in peace, which closed a number of years ago. Left the newsroom and began teaching at Denver Theological Seminary. And from there, I have taught at Milligan College in Northeast Tennessee. And I guess in education, I would be best known for my 20 years running the Washington Journalism Center. That was while I was teaching at Milligan and also Palm Beach Atlantic University. But then an entire decade doing that full time in Washington. So that's my professor hat was in there along the way. But what I never expected was that I would get to keep writing this column. So even after I went into teaching, I'm still doing this weekly column, which goes out to 300 something North American newsrooms. And I've now kind of set my sights on going at least a third of a century with that.
A third of a century. That's a pretty good amount of time, Jerry.
That's one way to put it. And on my better days, I figure if my health holds, maybe I'll go for 40. Who knows?
Oh my goodness.
But,
well, I mean, your column is kind of the go-to place for people that want to know what's going on in religion, because you just kind of seem to cover all the major topics. So,
well, I would disagree with that, actually. Let me tell you why I would disagree.
Okay. All right.
I think because I know my column runs primarily in smaller and middle-sized papers all over North America, I sometimes try to be deliberately off the beaten track. I deliberately try to write about subjects that I don't think anybody else is going to write about, and I don't have the resources to jump on an airplane and go cover stuff, at the moment it happens. But I usually try to find my own angle. And the way I describe it, if you know journalism parlance, you have feature stories, and then you have the sidebars. And the sidebars will be some weird and interesting angle of the other story that didn't fit in. I think over 31 to 2 years, I've learned how to spot what's going to be the sidebar to a lot of stories. Like this week, I just filed this morning, while everybody else is writing about Jerry Falwell Jr., primarily in terms of the scandal, frankly, because having covered the Jim and Tammy Baker scandal, I don't think we're going to know much about the scandal for quite some time. And you and I can talk about why I think that. I'm more interested right now in Liberty. What happens to Liberty University? What was Liberty University's strengths, at one time? I've been on probably 40, 50 Christian college campuses in America. And almost every Christian college that I know does something really well. They don't have the resources to do everything well, but they usually pick a subject and they focus on it and get it done well. So I was interested in trying to read up and figure out, what did Liberty used to do really well before it kind of got caught up in Falwell, Trump, online education, and the whole current money, power, and politics world that we live in at the moment. So I would say I try to find the weird angles that are next to the big stories.
Okay.
And the things that I don't think anybody else will write about.
Okay. Well, then I guess, Terry, let's jump right in. I mean, what is the synopsis of this thing? I mean, for those that aren't aware, I don't know how anybody is not aware of this.
Right.
Jerry Falwell Jr., who was the president of Liberty and the son of the well-known evangelical leader and very political leader also, Jerry Falwell Sr., obviously, was caught up in some questionable things relating to rumors that floated around and so forth, but there maybe wasn't actual action about it. There wasn't something to really stop him from being president of the university. And then I think it was maybe, I don't know, a month and a half ago or something like that, there was a picture that came out of him at a party with a young lady who was not his wife, in kind of a compromising position. And that really started the whole deal. But then just recently, obviously the story broke in much broader fashion. So why don't you go through and give us a little bit of a background on that and kind of how this developed, and then let's talk about how the impact is for Liberty.
If you're interested in the scandal itself, I would back up more than a year to the original coverage of the dealings between Falwell, who's a lawyer, by the way, not a minister, a lawyer, and has always specialized in kind of real estate deals and development in law, and built what some people say $500 million in addition to the campus at Liberty. And you had this bizarre story that did all of this kind of nod, nod, wink, wink stuff about these bizarre real estate connections between Falwell and Giancarlo Granda, otherwise henceforth named Pool Boy, the 20-year-old guy that they met at a hotel in Miami. And then, of course, the political angle had to come first. And the whole idea was that apparently there were some compromising photos, and the way they were described as between a husband and a wife. And the fixer for the Trump universe came down and managed to keep those photos from coming out.
You're talking about Michael Cohen.
Right.
Yeah.
And the to me, the most interesting thing about that is it does look remarkably well timed, because Falwell had been poised to endorse Senator Ted Cruz, who had announced his campaign for president in convocation at Liberty University.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden, Falwell switches to Trump. Now, the national press, because Falwell's a well-known name, Liberty is, from their perspective, huge. This immediately becomes the beginning of the 81% of all evangelicals love Trump myth and origin story. If you look at it from a more practical perspective, you can make a case that what Falwell did was give Trump enough credibility with a certain type of conservative evangelical that it helped get him to like 28 to 32% in the crucial early primaries, which allowed him to start building delegates. And because a bunch of other egotistical GOP candidates refused to drop out, that allowed Trump to build up a nest egg of delegates until then he begins to get 40% of the vote and 50% of the vote, right? So Falwell helped him get his early evangelical base, which is only half of who end up being the evangelicals who vote for him, the second half kind of coming on to the ship reluctantly.
Let me ask you about that real quick, Terry, because the evangelical world, a guy I like to have on, I've had on a couple times, and I'm going to have him on again. I know you're a fan of his work, is political scientist Ryan Burge, who came up with the idea of the nuns from the data. And
but hold it. He's done tremendous work on the nuns, and I hear there's a book. But
yes.
Really, the key work on the religiously unaffiliated is the Pew Forum.
Yes.
Research Center.
Yes.
And in particular, it even goes back before that came out to the work of a great political scientist and pollster named John C. Green, who is a name worth knowing. And I'd be glad to get you some links to where you can see what he's up to. He, to me, has been the most prophetic voice on this topic over the last 15 or so years in American research and polling.
Yes.
But
And
Ryan is the hot guy right now.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Cranking this stuff out.
I have definitely heard of John Green. Burge, I think, he's popularized the ideas because of his social media prowess, and he's got these graphs and things, and it communicates it. And he doesn't have like a huge number of Twitter followers, but if you look at who's following him on Twitter, it's a very influential crowd. So his stuff gets quite a large play. And including
very early on, he started contributing to Get Religion. And I like to think that also put his name in front of a small but interesting bunch of people.
Oh, no doubt. Well,
religion in the news quite carefully.
Well, and worth mentioning, we'll mention it later, and you already mentioned it, but your blog at Get Religion is really, really fascinating, and it covers all these kinds of things. So I'm curious, because at this point in the story, you talked about Jerry Falwell kind of creating a certain amount of credibility for Trump with evangelical Christians. Is it fair to say
of evangelical Christians?
Well, and that's kind of what I'm. Yeah, well, I'm wondering, because I do recall that period of time, and I remember when that happened and so forth. It seems to me that maybe the media, and this is where I'm curious because you cover the media so much, did the media ascribe more authority to a guy like Jerry Falwell Jr. than maybe he actually had with run-of-the-mill evangelical Christians? I mean, did they see him as like a figurehead for like all Protestants that were considered evangelicals?
Of course they did. And that's because of his name recognition and because he was connected with Trump.
Okay.
And meanwhile, let's take someone like he probably wouldn't like me doing this, but let's take someone like Ed Stetzer
Mm.
at the Billy Graham Center.
Yes.
That would be someone who would be infinitely more connected into different streams of evangelicalism across America. Or
Hmm.
look at some of the Southern Baptist leaders who have done so much work with Latino and African American evangelicals and stuff like that. But Falwell became a celebrity. And this is the point. And you had all of those media friendly events like Bernie Sanders coming to speak at Liberty. And then that fascinating convocation address, I'm sorry, not commencement address by Jimmy Carter. And then that which reminded people that Jimmy Carter and Jerry Falwell, the original senior, they
Hmm.
were actually pretty good friends. And
Hmm.
I would argue that Jerry Falwell Sr. was very much identified with Ronald Reagan, but was a completely different type of personality
Right.
than Jerry Falwell Jr.
Well, I mean, Jimmy
Not,
Carter has been called the first evangelical president, right? I mean,
well, which he was. I mean, I still remember sitting and looking at a TV screen one night. This is when I was in college, and I was actually active in the Jimmy Carter campaign at Baylor. Thought the world of him at that time, and still admire him a tremendous amount. I have a relative named after him. But put it this way, Carter, I remember the night when Carter gave that interview where he first began using the term born again. And I was watching ABC World News Tonight. And this was one of those moments that helped me decide I wanted to cover religion and became fascinated with this. And I believe it's Howard K. Smith was anchoring the desk that night. And at the end of the newscast, with that solemn face looking straight through the camera lens at all of America, he said, ABC News is investigating the born again Christians and will have a report in a later broadcast. And I'm thinking to myself, this is 40% of the population. I mean, you're acting like these people just landed from Mars, or that they're the Visigoths who are coming in from the piney woods of East Texas to sack blue zip code America. I mean, even though blue zip code America didn't really exist at that time. But anyway, you get my point. Carter scared the living daylights out of people. And for the first time, along with Roe versus Wade, crucial, you had religion news pouncing on the subject that newsrooms treat as a religion, which of course is politics and national politics and anything that gets anywhere near who gets to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. That's the be all and the end all of American culture at this time. So yeah, Jerry Falwell Sr., Jimmy Carter, it goes all the way back there. But this is all about celebrity Christianity, and Donald Trump is really what has this thing now boiling on the front burner of the stove.
yes. So now I guess, Terry, and thank you for that interlude because that helps. Because honestly, Jerry Falwell Jr., I mean, I will be frank with you. Before Donald Trump, I can't say I really knew a lot about Jerry Falwell Jr. I probably could have identified him as being associated with Liberty's leadership. Other than that, I really didn't know. I think of, among like scions in the evangelical world, Billy Graham's son, Franklin Graham, stands out to me, frankly, as being more prominent. But certainly Jerry Jr. came out and was promoted heavily by the Trump administration. So kind of then he gets caught into it. And as you pointed out, the timing maybe is interesting with everything.
Right.
So what kind of happens next in this story? How does this unfold after that?
Well, first of all, it's also important to realize that among evangelical educators in America, Liberty, kind of like Pat Robertson's Regent University, has always been the academic equivalent of the giant independent megachurch.
Mm.
And reporters have never figured out how to cover independent megachurches because they don't have a structure. There's no denominational ties. They love to claim big things about themselves, and they're just entrepreneurial engines.
Right.
Okay, well, Liberty, the way I put it in a piece the other day, was the rogue elephant in the fragile china closet of Christian education in America. They came barging in, but that's not the same thing as influence. Even being able to make a few other universities and colleges slightly afraid of you just as a force in the marketplace economically, even that isn't the same as influence. You want influence, that's Wheaton College, Calvin University, and some of your more prominent, I guess, Baylor's a Baptist university, not a Christian university, as I like to say. But you have to put Baylor in there as a major influence. So what really started this? Something in this relationship with Trump started pushing Jerry Falwell Jr. to speak out more often. And speak out he did on everything from, his concealed carry pistol in his back belt to, to real estate, to politics, to, et cetera, et cetera. He just began shooting his mouth off from that. Now, if you look at the timeline, and if all of what's being said about his private life turns out to be true, he's already way out of control at that point. So from the viewpoint of reporters, let's pause and say, what's the story now, actually, for reporters? Let me flash back to PTL. Once scandalous things start coming out, the most important thing reporters need to figure out is who actually wants these accusations to go to court. Who is willing to go on the record, go through the discover process, who wants to open up their books in order to force the other person to open up their books. So we need to watch all the anti-Falwell people with Giancarlo Granda as the poster boy.
Right.
We need to look and see whether they want to go to court, or does Falwell, who's a lawyer, want to go to court? Now that he's got his big settlement from Liberty and he's well set, who wants to go under oath? And until we find out who wants to go under oath, everything is just going to be shouting and rumors and sex and money scandal talk and all that. But we won't know, I don't think we'll know, until people either produce documents, and in the case of the PTL scandal, some documents did finally begin to surface. You look for documents and you look for who wants to go under oath.
$10 million he got when he left Liberty, Jerry Jr. I mean, is that exit even part of the scandal in a way? I mean, there's a lot of questions about how could you possibly provide such a soft landing for someone who's brought.
Hold it. All that would have been pre-negotiated.
Okay.
All of that would have been pre-negotiated before the scandal. And also, I mean, what do they think he is? A football coach? I mean, put that in exit package for football coaches.
Oh boy!
I mean, and this is a guy that gave them a $1.6 billion endowment or whatever it is. It's he has been a major player, and I'm sure that he was controversial enough that they had exit package stuff either negotiated. But you remember he resigned and then he unresigned and then he resigned again?
Right, yes.
They said that was because negotiations were still going on. For all we know, there's a clause in his contract where if he is proven guilty of some moral issue or something, they don't have to pay the settlement. Maybe he was convincing them to waive that and thus not drive Liberty through discovery.
Oh, in other words, so I mean, we're obviously, I mean, to be clear, if there's any lawyers watching this is all speculation about events that are in the public eye. So we're not doing anything that is scandalous here. I mean, this is already a scandal. It's a political and public scandal. But you're suggesting that it's possible that Liberty knew that having Jerry Jr. go out as an attorney, as somebody maybe who's got a litigious mindset, perhaps he would cause more issues if they didn't provide a nice soft landing with something like that.
But see, I don't know.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah. And also his last name is Falwell.
Yes, well, true.
I mean, and his brother Jonathan, of course, is the senior pastor at Thomas Rhodes. The way the father had prearranged, Jerry Sr. had arranged all this. My point in that speculation was simply to say, where does the story go from here?
Yes.
And what I was saying is the most important thing is A, who wants to go to court? Who wants to go under oath? And the second most important thing becomes the issue of what did the Liberty trustees know and when did they know it?
Oh
And
my
I
goodness.
don't think all of that as a private institution, if this was a state institution, a lot of that might occur in settings where some of it would come out. As a
Right.
private institution, no.
Hmm.
So when will we find out what the trustees knew? That's largely up to the trustees, and who knows?
I'm wondering, Terry, as far as the impact goes, I think for a lot of people that I've seen write about this, they are treating it as though this is a blow to the public perception of evangelical Christianity in America that may not be recoverable, and to the political status of evangelical Christianity in America that may not be recoverable. I mean, these are obviously, again, I've read a lot of different columns on this, and of course, you're covering it from a more sober perspective. But what is the ultimate impact of this? Is this going to be one of those things that in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, people look back and say that was an inflection point for the evangelical movement in American society?
Well, I don't know. See, so much of that depends on whether evangelicalism continues to be defined primarily in terms of celebrities and politics.
Hmm.
And if celebrities and politics is what matters, which seems to be how national media, especially television, cover these things, then yeah, this could have some impact. But if you're actually talking about the reality of American evangelicalism, no, I don't think this is all that important. I would say infinitely more important, and ask the Roman Catholics about what it's like to have a scandal live on with you for several decades. I think it's infinitely more important what's happening in the world of evangelical Christianity, especially large evangelical denominations and megachurches, how they end up dealing with the issue of sexual abuse, the whole Me Too era. I think ultimately that will be far more important than what happens to Jerry Falwell Jr. Now, the connection to Donald Trump is just built so strongly on this. Evangelicals just love Trump. White evangelicals think the world of the guy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a myth. That's a myth. Now, they are definitely probably going to vote for him again. But at that point, you have to ask, what are their alternatives?
Hmm.
What has the Democratic Party done to give them an alternative? I know a lot of evangelicals who, once again, are going to vote third party, or they're not going to vote again. Or maybe they're going to sneak into the booth and vote for Trump, but they don't want to tell anybody, because truth be told, they don't approve of Donald Trump. They simply don't believe that they have any option in the messed up, polarized politics of America right now. And a lot of them probably feel similarly to Jerry Falwell.
But let's say that
He's not their man. He's
Mhm.
not their voice.
Sure. Well, I mean, but Terry, let's say that that's the case, and let's say that Christians, there's a huge number of Christians that reject Trump personally and so forth, and obviously a lot of this falls into the realm of what Dr. Burge has told us is pretty much unmeasurable by polls. You'd have to track a huge number of people over a long period of time, he told me, in order to really gauge how people's perceptions change. And every individual person, it's almost impossible and extremely expensive if you could do it. So basically, what he told me, though, in a couple of different ways over the two programs we've done, is that the political affinity is more important in a lot of respects than the religious affinity. In other words, that for many people who are not especially engaged in their churches, being a Republican or being a Democrat for that matter actually drives more of their behavior than their religious preferences and so forth. I mean, is that something that you buy, or do you not put so much weight into that?
He and I argue about that a lot. And to some degree, I think and see, he disagrees with me on the centrality of abortion in this story. But there's no question that Roe versus Wade helped create and strengthen the original religious right connection to Ronald Reagan and then to the Republicans. And since that time, name a Democratic candidate that a lot of evangelicals would be strongly tempted to vote for. Now, let me put it from my point. As someone who was an evangelical Anglican back during those years, I was a huge fan of, ready for a shock?
Yes.
I was a huge fan of Bill Clinton and especially Al Gore.
Really?
Based on the fact that Al Gore had an 85% pro-life voting record while he was a senator from Tennessee.
Did he really? That's
Yes.
something I did not know.
And I thought that, and Clinton had signed the Arkansas bill defining life beginning at conception. I think that's right, that's how that was worded. I thought we had a potential for some kind of compromise on abortion where we would end up, not that this would please me theologically or personally, but I thought we were on our way to kind of a European style compromise to where regulation of abortion after viability was accepted as a norm. I thought that Clinton, Gore might put us there. So, I voted for Clinton, Gore. But on the first time, but not the second. Because, of course, the entire world spins into craziness with Bill Clinton and Al Gore once they're in power and become national level Democrats. And since then, so many of my evangelical friends, many of whom are names that some people would know, they've been in third party land for decades. And some of them may have voted for George W. Bush. They certainly didn't vote for John McCain in many cases. But a certain type of hyperactive, concerned evangelical has been in a political no man's land for several decades now. A friend of mine, a minister, he's not an evangelical, he's Orthodox, once told me about the fact much of his identity was being a Democrat. I mean, I have right around this corner in my office is a large framed hanging portrait of FDR.
Really?
Yeah, I consider myself a old FDR coalition Democrat. Back when you could be a Democrat anywhere in America, and there were blue collar Democrats and labor union Democrats and Catholic Democrats and Baptist Democrats. That old FDR coalition, if that coalition still existed today, I might be a part of it. But that is not a coalition that would be taking the stands we're currently seeing on religious liberty and life issues with the current Democratic Party.
Right.
And I think where Burge and I would agree is that a lot of this has to do with the rise of a coalition of the religiously unaffiliated, atheists, agnostics, and the few surviving liberal Protestants. That coalition, which two sociologists in New York City have dubbed the anti-evangelical voters. And they say they first spotted that coalition growing about 20 years ago. And they saw it in analyzing data about Democratic National Convention delegates. And these are people whose primary identity in political life is their opposition to traditional forms of religious culture. That's what really unites them more than any other issue. And John C. Green found that in the original religiously unaffiliated studies. What unites those people is their opposition to traditional forms of religion, specifically on matters of the sexual revolution.
So really, it's the opposition. Yes, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that coalition is now the largest identifiable religious group in the modern Democratic Party. And you have to keep them happy. But meanwhile, the modern Democratic Party still contains the African American church.
Right.
Which is one of the most intensely religious communities.
Yes. Yes,
America.
some of the highest church attendance of any group in the U.S.
And John C. Green noted this when the when I interviewed him, 8 years ago, when the original nuns study first came out, he predicted growing tensions. In fact, he predicted this in 2000. I have to look the data. Oh, I can tell you, it was right. It was right about the same time that Barack Obama announced he was going to run for president. It was right in that same time frame.
Really?
Green was already seeing the early materials that would become known as the nuns, religiously unaffiliated. And in a seminar at the Washington Journalism Center with a group of international journalists, I have this written up several times on Get Religion. It's easy to find. John C. Green said, one of the most fascinating stories in the next 2 decades of American political life. And he said this, add up 4 years of Trump, 8 years of Barack Obama. So back up, we're at least talking 14 years ago. He said one of the most fascinating stories is going to be, how does the Democratic Party keep the religiously unaffiliated, atheist, agnostic, religious liberals coalition happy while simultaneously retaining the loyalty of the African American church? Now, when you look at this year's Democratic primaries, ask Joe Biden if African Americans are important to his campaign after they saved his neck in South Carolina.
Yes. Well, I mean, Joe Biden really is probably as close as it gets in the modern Democratic Party to a fusion or a unity coalition type of candidate, right? I mean, how could you find anybody that's able to get, conservative, socially Black Protestants on board with the quote unquote woke left and I mean, a variety of different groups, right? I mean, he seems to be able to kind of do that. At least the convention would have you believe that.
Could he do that if the press was consistently asking him his opinions about the tax-exempt status of religious organizations and nonprofits, the future of Christian schools, the impact of LGBTQ rights on Christian ministries? If the press was pressing him on those issues and pressing him on his truly radicalized positions on abortion, where he's basically bought whatever they've asked him to buy, if the press was pushing him hard on those issues, would he be getting feedback from the African American church? You also have to ask this question. If we're talking about white evangelical Protestants having nowhere to go in terms of voting, are you really going to ask African American evangelicals to vote for Trump? Now, why do you think Trump rolled out a Republican convention speech docket that was like 25 to 30% Black, with a heavy emphasis on African American speakers? I think Trump thinks that in the current atmosphere of rioting and whatever else, a lot of which offends traditional African Americans in terms of looking at those people night after night, ruining their attempts to get police reform. One of the stories we're not getting reported right now is, who are the leaders of the peaceful legal demonstrations that occur before sunset, and who are the leaders of what happens after that? Because I think if you look at the legal demonstrations, I bet you're going to find a lot of African American Christians, African American leaders. And at the very beginning of this movement, after the Floyd death, there were quite a few demonstrations that were almost equally white and Black churches, Christians. Some of those early scenes of people kneeling to pray with kneeling policemen and all that, those were church people. That's not what's happening in Portland.
Yeah, I mean, I interviewed, a couple of Antifa folks, and it was very interesting. They had a gun behind them as we were talking. These particular individuals were in the West, but they were not in Portland. And it was kind of a little bit of a secretive thing, trying to make sure that there was some privacy there so that we could have the interview. And that was their requirement to have it. But I thought that what they had to say was worth hearing, frankly, because there haven't been a lot of interviews like that and haven't been a lot of things like that. It does seem that it is hard for maybe the modern Democratic Party to keep those people on board who are, let's say, a little bit more conservative socially, or they view these riots as problematic. On the other hand, though, I don't know that all of those people necessarily want to vote for President Trump either. So I mean, maybe
no, they don't.
So would they? So let's say that you are. So let's say that Black Democrats, there's a swath of them that simply, are not a fan of what's going on in the present situation. They don't like Biden really that much, and they don't like maybe Kamala Harris because at least when she was running for president, we don't know necessarily what the present breakdown is, but when she was running as a candidate for the nomination, she didn't seem to pull any measurable percentage of the Black vote, actually. Yeah. So, I mean, where do they go, Terry? Did they just not vote, or what's the deal?
No, they're going to vote for Biden.
They will.
The issue is how many of them turn out. You can make a case that for Trump and for the Republican Party, I agree with Burge that there has been this growing sense of loyalty among churchgoers in America to the Republican Party. He and I may disagree on why that is, but we both agree that the identity of the Republican Party with church-going Americans, and by church-going Americans, I'm meaning weekly church-going Americans, not 3 times a year or whatever. I think we can agree that they have gone intensely Republican. I find shocking the numbers that he keeps turning out, showing that a majority of people that we consider part of the liberal mainline Protestant world voted Trump, and have now continued to skew Republican. But that's, of course, also linked to the diverging political, cultural, theological, moral views in the liberal mainline churches between the people in the pews and the people in the pulpits. And that's a story I've covered for multiple decades as well. You want to go back to Falwell and Liberty?
Yeah, I'd kind of like to connect it. We are a little bit off the track, but I do think it relates because, the ultimate question that is asked in all of these different articles, or at least that is implied, is how will this affect the election, or will it? I mean, is this going to have any impact, you think, on evangelicals voting for President Trump?
No, I don't. In large part because of the simple reality, who else are they going to vote for? They're either going to go third party or they're going to stay home. And looking at what's happening in the streets, I would argue that the protesters are filming Republican commercials every night. And some people say that between 9 and 11% of Americans no longer tell the truth when they're asked who they plan to vote for president. And some people say that the secret Trump voter was why he won. Because you look at the polls,
sure,
Trump was getting stomped still. And then election night comes and it turns out there were all these people that secretly voted for him. One devout Christian that I know here in Tennessee, the way he put it to me, I may have said this to you before. He said, I went in, I voted for Trump. I went out to my pickup truck. I got in my truck and I threw up.
No, I don't think you told me that story. That's pretty intense.
Because I couldn't believe I had voted for Donald Trump.
Wow.
He said, but what's my option? What was my option? Hillary? And on religious liberty issues, which was the big thing for him, could he vote for Hillary? Now flip that around. You're now an African American Christian. Are you going to vote for Trump? What would it take to get you to vote for Trump? I'm still convinced, I can't remember if you and I discussed this before, I'm still convinced that Donald Trump is president today because of the votes of Latino Pentecostals and evangelicals in the state of Florida.
It's very interesting. You may have mentioned that before, but I mean, where do you think, well, explain that theory a bit, but then also I'm curious what your thought is on where the swing is this time. I mean, obviously, guys like Dr. Burge, they say, well, it's this working class guy in Pennsylvania and Michigan and so forth,
Mhm.
that is kind of the swing person. But what do you have to say on the Latino Pentecostals? That's a very interesting.
Well, first of all, he needed every vote he could get in Florida to win.
Yes, fair
The
enough.
fact that there was a big turnout in the interstate highway regions around Orlando, where there are massive megachurches of Latino evangelicals and other evangelicals. And somewhere in the figures in the Latino vote, Trump's numbers went up way higher than anybody expected. Now we're not talking a majority, of course not. We're talking the difference between Trump getting 8% of the vote and getting 22% of the vote.
Hmm.
But in that close of an election, folks, there's not that many Cubans in Florida. Some other Latinos were voting for him. And to me, I've never seen the poll data because nobody thought to ask. To me, the most logical explanation is Latino evangelicals and Pentecostals, of which there are many in Florida. Having lived in Florida, I can tell you that's a large, growing community in Florida, especially in Orlando and in the Orlando area. So, but once again, here's my point. What are the swing voters? I'm going to quote John C. Green. John C. Green says, what we got here is another election where the president, he was talking about this 4 years ago. He said, this election will be decided by Catholics who go to Mass once a week instead of going to Mass once a month.
Hmm.
And if the Catholics who go to Mass once a week vote for Trump, he wins Ohio, and then he could be president. And then you look at Trump is president today because of Florida and the Rust Belt.
Yes.
And the Rust Belt is not a powerful area for white evangelicals. So the critical issue remains what it always is: Catholics. The swing vote in American politics is Catholics who go to Mass every week or every other week. The active American Catholic is one of the last of the true swing votes in American life.
Well, Terry, let me pin you down as I did Dr. Burge when we spoke. By the way, he thinks that those Rust Belt folks that are the swing voters are actually many of them non-religious. That's kind of his thinking on it, and that's what we discussed in the last interview. So I'm curious as to your opinion on that. But before we do that, who's going to win? If you had to put money on it,
I have no clue. It should be Biden.
You think Biden is likely to win?
With him. And Biden would have cleaned the floor with him 4 years ago. Hillary was the only person he could have beaten. The issue is, if you're old enough to remember Bill Clinton, how Sister Souljah will Biden go on the violence in the streets? And will Biden stand on the front steps of the Capitol or something with 200 African-American clergy or something and say, the future is police reform. The future is helping our policemen do better jobs, getting them, cameras that they wear on their uniforms. We're going to listen to traditional African-American citizens, clergy, and I'm going after police reform. Not rioting, not tearing down the Washington Monument and moving it somewhere else, which, if you've been following the headlines, the city government of Washington, D.C. has recommended moving the Washington Monument and the Jefferson Memorial Monument somewhere else so they can be contextualized into a context of racism.
That'd be quite an expensive moving job. It's not like moving a few boxes from one home to another.
Yeah.
That's expensive.
Now, is that a Trump commercial waiting to happen?
Yeah, I emailed Ryan Burge, and I have spoken with a few people about this who have said that they think Biden kind of has it in the bag. And in the context of this, it's if if someone believes Biden has it, I mean, obviously that is a conclusion that's very reasonable based on the polling. But it does appear, and some of the news aggregators, as well as more, let's say, conservative-leaning outlets, we're noticing this. Although you try to ascribe weight to everything based on kind of where it is. But it does appear that the riots and so forth have become a very substantial part of the Trump campaign's messaging, and then perhaps that secret Trump voter that you mentioned won it in 2016 for him, and maybe again will win it for President Trump, is that person is really activated by this kind of messaging. I mean, do you think that is where it's going now? Is that swinging it more towards the president, or is it maybe not having as much of an impact?
No, I mean, it could help him, and I don't know, but when you're considering that somewhere between 9 and 11% of the American voting public isn't going to tell pollsters the truth, or is just going to hang up on them, this adds a factor that means it's very hard to know what they are or are not going to do. I'm saying, what does Biden need to do to lessen that impact? And once again, so much of that is up to him. I mean, meanwhile, you have the New York Times printing stories about how, that everybody has a right to be concerned about the safety of the protesters in these night protests. Well, is anybody really, is middle America wondering about the safety of the people who are setting the buildings on fire? And once again, one of the big stories in American journalism that we're not getting right now is the difference between Black Lives Matter, the slogan, movement, and the cause, which started out as primarily about police reform and safety for African Americans, versus Black Lives Matter, the kind of the organization itself,
right,
which has some pretty wild beliefs and whatever else. Then whatever this thing is at night, whatever the people with the vans and the combat shields and the Molotov cocktails and the white college-age people, the guys that got shot the other night in Kenosha, all three of them had police records. I mean, these are not African-American, middle-of-the-road people in suits and ties marching next to Martin Luther King singing hymns. It's a different look. And I think it would be interesting, or you'd be hard-pressed to even find out what the goals are of the Nighttime Coalition. Can Biden do something symbolically that allows him to reject what's happening at night and clearly present himself as on the side of the mainstream African-American business owner, clergy person, churchgoer, Democrat? What can he do to put the emphasis back on the old coalition of civil rights workers who had goals? They had attainable goals. They had links into mainstream society. They were not producing a charter that all but calls for the end of the nuclear family, and things like that.
Well, you make a very important point that, there's Black Lives Matter as kind of a hashtag movement, right? People just saying, oh yeah, I support that. I believe that, racial equality is important. And I know a lot of folks that put that out there, and that is kind of the reason they do it. But as you say, there is a Black Lives Matter organization, which is much more of a far left organization, and has
key leaders that are self-professed Marxists, for example.
Right. Yes. So, it's certainly on the far left end of the spectrum of, you might even say, this movement, because it doesn't seem that most people that want racial justice are just, on the far left. That's kind of a broad thing.
But please note, and it's very important to note, I did not ascribe the violent night protests to the Black Lives Movement organization.
Correct. Right.
I don't think we know that.
Right.
I don't think we know the degree that there is even occasional overlap there. I'm saying that the press isn't doing a good job of carving into three distinct parts of the story the original Floyd coalition, who held a funeral for him in a Southern Baptist church in Houston with massive amounts of clergy, excuse me, and others turning out. By the way, I don't think the national media, other than a couple of newspapers like the Washington Post, I believe, did, told America that that was a Southern Baptist church that funeral was in.
You're right. I didn't see that almost anywhere. Here in Houston, that was well known. That was well covered. But I mean, you know, I wasn't anywhere else. Yeah.
Okay, but once again, I want to get the distinction. Black Lives Matter, the movement and the concern for police reform, safety, and justice versus Black Lives Matter, the organization, which has a wider and much more specific agenda that's quite controversial with a lot of Americans, including African Americans. And then ultimately, what I think is as far as we know, a third thing, which is whoever is funding, organizing, and carrying out these night protests that take the legal, peaceful demonstrations that Americans can affirm, at least as First Amendment rights, and is turning them into the violent disaster scenes that we're seeing now at night that are burning down businesses of white people, Latino people, Asian people, Black people, whatever. Three different stories, and I don't think the American media is doing anything to separate those three levels of concern and activism.
Well, I mean, Terry, that brings, and I want to begin winding it down to be respectful of your time, Terry, but I have a couple of questions I have to ask you before we do that. I think what you're talking about with the media is so interesting because I've become very concerned, very, very concerned about polarization, not merely in the sense of, oh, you know, we don't like each other or whatever, person on the left, person on the right, they don't get along. It seems to me now, with the violent acts that are occurring, with the prominence of guns on the streets during these protests and so on and so forth, that we are crossing a point of a point of no return, that we are really kind of getting into a place where this may honestly have much broader implications. And I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily a civil war, and even if it were, for heaven's sakes, a civil war would look much different than it did in the 1860s. But it seems to me that it could be this violence becomes a normative thing in America. This movement, this group of people, whatever you're suggesting, people causing issues. And I would say, I mean, to be fair, it's been identified that there are groups on the left and that there are also some on the right as well. It's not just one or the other. I think there are a variety of groups that are trying to cause issues, and it's hard to say who it is, although obviously the protests are more left-leaning. But it is very fair, I think, to say that this is becoming normative. This is becoming something that people almost expect. Do you feel like this is going to be an expanding phenomenon in our country, that we are almost going to experience civil conflict as part of daily life from now on for some period of time? I mean, or is that overblown? I mean, and again, civil war, I don't want to throw that term around loosely. That's a pretty intense term, but what are your thoughts, Terry Mattingly, religion journalist and coverer of these things? What do you think?
Well, yeah, except you've now moved into the world of combat in the streets and ultimately the entire political scene. My interest in a lot of this, of course, is 90% based on religion.
Yes.
So let me turn it around and ask you a question.
Fair enough.
How many mainstream media stories have you seen, especially on television? How many stories have you seen about the role of the Black church in the current discussions?
Close to zero.
Close to zero.
Right.
Now, you believe that African-American churchgoers, clergy, some of them with decades of experience in civil rights, do you believe that they're just sitting at home going, oh, this doesn't have anything to do with me, I don't care?
No, I mean the information I have, and based on the conversations I've had about this, it would seem that there's great consternation about the messaging and the appearance of this in the
Yes.
political sphere, and how to influence America to move towards true what many believe is an important issue, racial justice, for
So,
heaven's sake. So yes.
so what we can sign off here with is one of the problems in the current situation is America's two competing media cultures,
Hmm.
left and right. Neither one of them seems all that interested right now in the voices of mainstream and church based African American life.
Mm.
You going to see that story on Fox?
Nowhere. I mean, it doesn't,
Well,
and it
you
doesn't
might.
really matter if it's right or left. You know, Terry Mattingly, at your Get Religion blog, people can read all about how the media often miscovers religion, and there's probably a few other little things. What else are you thinking about these days, or what other topics can people read about if they go over and read your column and read your articles on Get Religion?
Well, I mean, we started off that we were going to talk about
Jerry
Jerry
Falwell.
Falwell and
Yes.
Liberty.
Yes.
I am intensely interested in the story of what happens to Liberty University
Yes.
because I think that's a community that it includes people that I know and respect. I've had friends on the faculty for a long time, one of whom, Karen Swallow Pryor, who has now gone to Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary to teach. So I would urge people to try to watch that story in terms of who wants to actually go to court and who seems to be willing to go under oath, because who produces documents and who undergoes oath is crucial. Two, I would ask them to look at the actions of the Liberty trustees, who ends up being selected as leaders at Liberty, and what happens to that institution. Now, we've spent most of our time talking about American politics. I will go back to this again. Who is going to cover mainstream African American America
Hmm.
in zip codes outside the struggling, I'll go ahead and say it, Democrat controlled cities? Who is going to listen to normal African American voters? And specifically, will someone please tell me what's going on among the respected, veteran, peaceful, wise leaders of the African American church, including in denominations such as the Southern Baptist Convention, the Assemblies of God, the Church of God in Christ. There was this quiet little story the other day from the Associated Press. The Church of God in Christ and the Assemblies of God, I think it is, the National Association of Evangelicals, are working behind the scenes to produce a package on police reform.
Really?
What could we endorse together in terms of police reform? What part of the union contracts for policemen do we need to revise and improve? So actually think back to the first couple of weeks after Floyd, before things went as crazy as they are now, and simply ask yourself a question. Where's the Black church? Who is going to listen to them? Who respects them? Who is interested in their point of view? And who is willing to quote it accurately? That's a huge story for me. And I think Joe Biden would be wise to ask those questions. And whoever it was close to Trump who put lots of African American heroes on the stage at the Republican National Convention, and I don't think Trump had anything to do with any of that in my cynicism about him, watch for the Black community and the Black church in the next 2 to 3 months. Who's going to cover them? That's what I would urge listeners to pay attention to.
Terry Mattingly, always an interesting analysis of many things. Yes, we got a little bit off into politics. It's hard not to do that now, frankly, because it's getting so hot. But I appreciate your synthesis of considering where some of these very important demographic groups are within the religious landscape and how maybe that will affect the election, as well as this Falwell situation, which, as you say, we will only really know what's going on if we get some information, as you say, a private
Yeah.
university. So, but of course,
Documents and testimony under oath.
yes, and
That's all
I have no doubt that we will know more. I just don't know how much, but I'm sure when we do, we will be talking to you about it. Terry
Yep.
Mattingly, getreligion.org. .org, and your column is syndicated in an awful lot of newspapers around the country, and many other things you do. Terry, thank you for joining us today.
Glad to. And there's about a 28-year library of my columns at tmat.net.
Yes, tmat.net. Yes, fascinating, and I have gone through some of that archive, and it is really good stuff because you have covered all of the major events that people are familiar with in religion over the last 28 years, as you say. So, Terry, thank you for joining us today.
Okay, thank you.
And that was religion journalist Terry Mattingly. Remember that you can subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast service or on YouTube. We certainly appreciate that and your support of our program. Thanks for listening.